Yeah, okay. So welcome everybody. We're recording this so that people who are having trouble getting into the conversation can follow it afterwards. I'm Fiona Weir, and I'm one of the organisers or disorganisers of the Huddersfield's Death Cafe. We're set up maybe 5 years ago. We don't meet very often. And the kind of, I don't know if people know about the Death Cafe movement, but it's an international movement designed really to provide space in which people can think about and talk about death and dying, to destigmatize it. And it isn't a therapeutic community. It isn't somewhere where people come and talk about their own personal experiences of death and dying and people around them, but really just to be talking about ideas around death and dying. And we've had a couple of face-to-face meetings, a couple of online meetings, and I happened to see, I think it was probably on Facebook, a post for Andrew's new book, This Mortal Coil, A History of Death, and was really kind of excited to discover that Andrew, or to realise that Andrew and I both live in Huddersfield. So I messaged him slightly cheekily and said, Andrew, do you want to come and do an online talk for us? And I wasn't really expecting him to say yes, but he did. So here we are. Andrew is a neuroscientist, a professor at the University of Manchester, and has written his book. Well, I'm going to ask him really about that, the kind of conversation about the links and what drew him into writing this book. But let's start. Andrew, could you just tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, as you said, I'm a neuroscientist and I'm also a professor of biochemistry at the University of Manchester. So I've been in Manchester about 25 years. So I studied natural science at Cambridge, and I was a postdoc at Stanford in California. And then I was originally interested in chemistry and proteins. And then when I was originally was a postdoc in Stanford, I found this great application of the sort of pure science I was doing on proteins, which is when proteins go wrong and they stick together, they start killing cells, and the cells that they can kill are brain cells, and you can get Alzheimer's. So there was this great connection between sort of the studies of proteins I was doing and disease. So that's how I put that all together, and I've been working various things. In this field, we're interested in drugs, trying to stop the proteins going wrong and develop new Alzheimer's drugs. I've got a spin-out company called Pharmacare at the moment. I'm trying to get funding to do some clinical trials and testing some of our drugs that interfere with these proteins. I spend a lot of time teaching, and I'm program director for a biochemistry course in Manchester.
Right, yeah. And so was it that clinical research that led you into thinking you would write a book about death, or was it something else?
So there was one specific thing in the teaching, which was teaching about dementia. One of the things I addressed and had a couple of slides on is the enormous growth in it. So it's now the #1 cause of death for women in this country, #2 for men. But 100 years ago, it was practically non-existent. I mean, Alzheimer, the disease is named of, he was a German who described the disease, and he had one patient that he'd saw in 6 years, and he'd never seen anybody with this condition before. So that kind of intrigued me. And the other thing I've been interested in for decades, a thing called the bills of mortality. I can show you that.
Yeah, do.
So if we go to, yeah, here we are. See these slides?
It's just loading. There we go. Yeah, Searches of the Dead.
Searches of the Dead. Yeah. So I'll just give you a bit of background as to this was the thing that really got me interested in causes of death, because I found out about this when I was a teenager, and it kind of stuck in my head for years. So Searches of the Dead. So in 1592, as you can see here, London had plague epidemics every so often. In 1592, the Mayor of London issued a law, and he said that there were going to be these ancient women who were responsible, generally widows, and they had these this job called Searchers of the Dead. And their job was to, every time somebody died in London, they would ring a bell and the Searchers of the Dead would go and view the body and record what they died from. So this is a contemporary picture. So these are the searchers at the front, and they'd go around in pairs and they'd carry these big red sticks to warn people, really, because people were frightened of them because they would go and see the dead and they thought they could spread disease and so on. And they were worried that they were witches and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, burying the dead with the bell before them, so the bell would summon the searchers. So initially, the reason they did this was to track plague. So they recorded causes of death, but the first scheme they used to classify the dead was this, which is that's it. They died from plague, or they died from something else. And that was all they used for 40 years. So the mayor wanted to know if there was a new plague outbreak, and then they could do things like try and control it. The way we do is social distancing, so they close the theatres to stop it spreading and so on. So they used that system for 40 years. And then they thought this second category of not plague could be broadened a bit. So they started publishing these things called the Bills of Mortality. So the searchers reported the causes of death, and every parish in London would compile them. And they put them together with these things called Bills of Mortality, which is they publish every week all the things that people died from in the city. And then that's one example from February 1664. Okay, there's a bit smaller to kind of highlight this. And all our data on what people die from starts here. So now we have the world.
Just in case he's watching on a smaller screen.
I'll blow up some interesting parts in a minute.
Yeah, okay, cool.
So now the World Health Organization, there's a thing called the International Classification of Diseases, and that everybody in the entire world follows this scheme, and you kind of, there's a set list of possible causes of death, and this is how we can track what people die from across the world. So there you go. So in this week, 393 people died, half men, half women, no plague, so that's good. But if you jump to a year and a half later, look at this. Look at the number of deaths. And 393 have gone to 7,690 in just 1 week, and they're mostly dying of plague. This is when the plague was absolutely raging in 1665.
1665, yeah.
And this is what they were tracking. And I think many of the others where it just says fever, that's probably plague as well. So anyway, the bright side of this, searchers were paid per call. But it was a nice little earner for Searchers of the Dead, inspecting all these bodies. Wow. So what else do we have on here? And then if you take a look at this, some really strange things. So the number one cause of death is, in addition to plague, is infectious disease. This is highlighting some of those. So consumption, that's probably tuberculosis. Fever and spotted fever will be some kind of infectious disease. King's evil, that's tuberculosis, another form of tuberculosis. Rising of the lights, so lights means lungs, and rising of the lights means coughing up blood.
Right.
It's a horrible lung disease. Many of these deaths were young children. So chrysome 20, that's a child who died before being baptized. That's a newborn. An infant would be a young baby. Teeth doesn't mean they died of tooth decay. They died at an age when they were teething, so about a 1-year-old or something like that.
Oh, okay.
And childbed is died in childbirth.
Yeah.
And there's some really strange ones here. You could die being frightened. You could die of lethargy, grief, or planets, which is you died of astrology. So you died because you were a Virgo and Jupiter was in Sagittarius or something like that.
Wow.
And there are all sorts of other things. You could die from trouble and depression, suddenly, whatever that means, sinking of the spirits as well as rising of the lights. You could die from sighing. You could die by being distracted. Maybe you were run over because you weren't paying attention, I don't know. You could die from melancholy. Overlaid. This is again a newborn baby that was dying from suffocation, right? So what they said was the mother had rolled over in the night and suffocated the baby. And this may have been infanticide. It's right. An unwanted baby.
Or what we might call cot death now.
Well, possibly, yes. And Spanish disease, syphilis, that's just being rude about the Spanish. But the other thing that intrigues me about this is that what's missing. So there we do have cancer. One person died of cancer in the entire city of London that week, apparently. And nobody died of heart attack, stroke or dementia, so it says.
So our leading causes of death are not there at all, which it kind of skips us ahead to a question that I had in my head. But before we do that, I just want to ask you, I want to kind of rewind a little bit, because I'm looking at some of these and some of them seem quite funny and some of them seem, one of us is,
Oh, I can't hear you, Fiona, there's a lot of echo.
Yeah, there is, isn't there? Oh, maybe that stopped.
If everybody else here could go on mute, that'd be helpful. Oh, it seems to be okay now. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, Hart, I think you've got your mic on somewhere. If you just, here we go.
There we are.
Great, thank you very much. So I mean, maybe this is a bit of a daft question, but we've got these ancient women going and kind of recording whether people are dead or not, and it raised the question for me of maybe a very basic question, but what is death from a physiological, from the point of view of a biologist or a neuroscientist? What is death?
Now we would define it as irreversible brain death, but in the past they would use if you stopped breathing, and then mistakes were made if people stopped breathing. You could be you'd have hypothermia or something, or you could, you've nearly drowned or something like that, and you could think somebody has died when they hadn't. So that's not ideal because mistakes were made. And now we would say irreversible brain death. However, there is a grey area. What if part of the brain is irreversibly damaged and part of the brain is still working? And then you get these conditions like persistent vegetative states and comas. Somebody, so the brain stem is in the middle of your brain at the bottom, and that's the part that is responsible for basic bodily functions like keeping your heart beating and breathing and digestion and so on. And if your brain stem is okay, then you can be kept in hospital and you can stay awake for years. But if you may have other parts of the frontal cortex damaged and you're never going to be able to wake up. So there's kind of a grey area there, right?
Right.
Persistent vegetative states. That's why you have these, awful cases where, they need to talk to the family and they say this person's never going to wake up. Should we turn the machine off and things like that?
Yeah, so definitions of death have been presumably very influenced by the technologies that have been available at different.
Yes, and what we can measure and things like this. So we would tend to go for the brain stem as the most important part, because if your brain stem isn't working, then your heart's going to stop, and then that's pretty simple.
Right.
But there may be parts of the brain that are damaged, so you're never going to be conscious again, but your bodily functions are still working, and that's where these issues come in. Yeah, and then it goes, scientists say, we need some guidance here. We need the law to get involved and consult the community and come up with some sensible rules that we need to follow.
And medical, social and legal norms all kind of agreeing on what a definition is going to be.
Yeah, there was a case I wrote about 20 years ago with a guy called Tony Bland, who was in the Hillsborough disaster. And he was in one of these persistent vegetative states for 4 years. He was 18 at the time at Hillsborough. And the doctors and his family agreed there was no point unless you turn the ventilator off, right? And then the doctors got some advice on this, and the coroner said, if you turn that machine off, as far as I'm concerned, you're guilty of murder.
Wow.
So they went to, anyway, they ended up changing the law such that it was possible to turn this off. And because it wasn't in the patient's interest just to keep his body alive like this, because there was no doubt that he could never wake up. So that's the kind of thing that can happen. Yeah, and as you're right, it's driven by technology. Yeah.
So we've got on this sheet, and what you were saying before I asked you that little diversion, there's a whole load of causes of death that are quite different from the sorts of causes of death we might expect to see described nowadays.
Yep.
So I'm guessing there are some trends in death.
Oh, very much so, yeah. So this is the question, the one in red here, this is the question that I sought to answer.
Right.
Why are the causes of death in the past so different to those today we see today?
So can take us to give us a kind of like, obviously you can't summarize your entire book in a few minutes, but just kind of give us some what has changed about the ways that we die.
Right, one slide.
Lovely, perfect, yeah.
Well, so why were the causes of death in the past so different to those we see today? So because we've defeated largely the things that used to kill us, right?
Okay.
So and there's chapters on all of these things, but really, really briefly, before we lived in states, there were no laws, and 1 in 6 people have died of violence, right? We find these skeletons from the Stone Age with evidence of wounds from weapons and arrowheads in their bones and things like this. People were killing each other much more frequently than they do these days. And then when we had states and kings and so on imposing law and say you can't do that, there was much less violence. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Another one is famine. So famine was absolutely endemic. If you had a good harvest, then the babies survived and your population went up. Then if you had a bad harvest, people were going to starve. And the first country to defeat famine were the Dutch a few hundred years ago, with various ways in which they began to were able to feed their population and not just, stimulate a larger population which was going to end up starving. And now famine's very rare, which is not really appreciated. There's much less famine than there used to be.
Fair to say that's depends on where you're looking. I guess in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, there's still.
Let me show you some data. Okay, so there we are. Defeating famine. So these are the things that the Dutch did it. So how the Dutch did it. Trade and transport. They were importing food from other countries, so that would mitigate against a harvest failure. You could get food from somewhere else. They have a wider variety of foodstuffs. The land reclamation, the famous windmills, they were creating more farmland. Better crops. So people better crops and animals. They started doing, we think these giant vegetable competitions are quite amusing, but these things are people sharing their best breeds of animals and their best crops is really valuable, massively increasing yields, right? New crops, so most of these are from the Americas, these things from the Americas. So things like potatoes and tomatoes, these are so key to our diet, but they didn't exist 500 years ago, right? And these are, and immigration, so people left the Netherlands, and this is the Dutch Empire, so we defeated famine. And if we look, this is rates of dying from famine from 1860 till now, okay? And look how low it is in the recent decade.
That's very interesting, yeah.
The countries with famine now are Yemen, South Sudan and North Korea, but nearly all of Africa is feeding itself now rather than endemic famine. There hasn't been bad famines in Asia since the Great Deep for 50 years, really.
That's fascinating. And what that makes me think of then is the famines that we know that have happened in the 20th century in sort of Eastern Europe that have been, well, that were political as much as anything else. So the Soviet Union using famine.
Yes, so famines are caused by politics. So the worst famine in the 1960s was the Great Leap Forward in China, caused by Mao Zedong. Wars caused famine. The dreadful communist governments in the Soviet Union had regular famines. They harvest failures. As I said, North Korea has the world's worst government. They have famine. Open societies that share information and trade. Democracies don't have famine. The countries that you just don't tolerate. India, right? India had regular famines under the British Empire when it was misruled by us. They haven't had a famine since independence, even though the population has tripled. So there's all these things are really good.
Yeah, and really important to kind of understand that if you're trying to work out what's happening in global politics.
Yeah,
we sometimes think of famine as being, and I think we think of famine as being driven by the weather, but what you're saying is that isn't the case. It isn't.
Right. So yes. So weather will cause harvest failures. But harvest failures will only trigger famine where you have a closed country that denies they have a problem, suppress it, won't get help from other countries, and so on. Yeah,
really interesting. So that slide that you just showed us, that were the types of death we don't see anymore.
Oh yeah. Shall I go back to that?
Can we go back to that one? Yeah.
Yes, this. Oh yes, okay. Shall I carry on with this?
Yeah, do please.
So childbirth. So 500,000 years ago, the number one cause of death for women was probably childbirth. And that doesn't happen anymore. And I thought initially this is because of cesarean sections and things like that, which helped, but death in childbirth was mostly defeated by the two things. Number one of the greatest inventions we've ever had, which is forceps.
Yeah.
Which halves death in childbirth.
Yeah.
And the second one is hand washing, when we realized that what was happening, that many women in hospitals, they'd give birth and they'd pick up an infection, bacterial infection.
Yeah.
And then when they realized this was happening and got doctors and midwives to wash their hands and bedding and clothing and things like that, they weren't picking up infections, and then death in childbirth greatly dropped. So these are just seem really simple ideas, and they've had enormous benefit. Plague, I already kind of alluded to this with the social distancing, quarantine system. So plague would always come in through ships. So seaports like Venice and Marseille would, if they suspected a ship had plague, they wouldn't let them into the city for 40 days. They keep them offshore. And the word quarantine comes from quarante, which is Venetian dialect for 40. And this really stopped the spread. So isolation, and what they actually did in London when they had the Great Plague there is they'd force you in your house and they'd nail the door shut. They'd put an armed guard outside and you couldn't come out for a month. And you and all your family would probably die, but it stopped the spread of disease. So realizing the importance of stopping contagion was helpful. And then the biggest thing is infectious disease. So we kind of know about vaccination and drugs, but even before we'd had vaccination and drugs, this was dropping. And the most important thing was sanitation. So providing clean drinking water, sewage systems, and better nutrition, better diet, healthy bodies. Young children then could fight off disease rather than killing them. And we got to this. So this is Massachusetts. This is causes of death from 1840 until now, and the blue is infectious disease. And you can see how it just dropped from 1880 to 1940. So
right, yeah. So it's just dropped. Apart from that little spike in 1920.
Oh, well, that's not a little spike. Do you know what that is?
First World War? Don't
know. That is Spanish flu.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Spanish flu kills twice as many people as the First World War. I mean, they're linked because it was terrible in Germany, for example, because people were starving in Germany for years, so they had less resistance to disease, and it was spread by soldiers. But anyway, the numbers, so you get spikes. We still have infectious disease like COVID springs to mind, right?
Yeah.
But the broad trend is infectious disease goes, apart from these epidemics. And we're going to have new epidemics, we're going to have new strains of influenza and so on and so on. But they're nasty but short term. Yeah. So
I asked you about the trends, and this slide is based on trends, isn't it? So we've got infectious diseases just dropping, injuries kind of more or less staying the same, and heart disease, and you mentioned Alzheimer's as well.
Yeah, I can show you some data on this as well if you like.
Yeah.
So life expectancy in France. So this shows infectious disease was fading away the late 19th century, right? It's the same in Europe. this is life expectancy in France, and France, because they have the best data, so it's accurate data back to 1816, right? And you can see up to about 1860, 1870, it didn't really budge. It was 40, okay? And that didn't mean people lived to be 40. It meant that lots of young children were dying. And there were dips. So some of these dips are cholera, and then it started to rise. So this is sanitation and better nutrition, and life expectancy was going up by 10 years by about 1900, and then it steadily rose. Well, I can show you. So life expectancy for the last 150 years has increased by 6 hours per day. So it's gone up from 40 to 80. Yep.
Wow, 6 hours a day.
Yep, that's 40 years increase per 150 years is 6 hours per day.
Gosh.
So now is by far the highest life expectancy we've ever had. I know there are blips. I'm taking the really broad long-term view of hundreds, if not thousands of years here. But it rises. And why? We can explain this one here.
Oh yeah, go on then.
So the top, these are good things. So I said sanitation. Vaccines were invented late 19th century, apart from smallpox, much earlier. First drugs that really used were like sulfur drugs, 1920s. And then antibiotics, 40s and 50s. And then modern medicine steadily rising. And then bad things, wars are bad. So
yeah.
You asked about World War One. That's World War One, and that's Spanish flu, you see.
Yeah.
Oh, and the dashed line, that's men. So if you look at World War One, you can see it killed French men, but not French women.
Yeah.
And then Spanish flu killed both.
Yeah.
And that's World War Two. It was a double dip because they were fighting in France in 1940, and then after the D-Day landings, that's why you get double dip.
Right.
And then it bounced back. Yeah. So, and there's all sorts of little trends. That's the Wall Street crash and things like this.
Oh. So as you were doing all this research, were there any surprises?
Yes.
Did you?
So I'm a biologist, and I knew life expectancy had zoomed up, and I thought it's because of medicine. I thought it was because of drugs and medicines and vaccination, and no, the best thing we probably ever had was providing clean water and decent housing and sewage and things like that, for increasing life expectancy. And politics, so as I said, famine is caused by bad politicians. So if you have good government that will maintain peace and trade and all this kind of stuff, and provide health services and look after your people, this is crucial. Yeah. So medicine is less important than I thought. So yeah, things like forceps and hand washing, this seems really basic solutions. And feeding people well. And I said law, that's another aspect of good government. And quarantine, governments maintain these systems, right? They make they enforce social isolation when they work. So drugs, it's only the last 100 years we've had drugs. If you're sick now, you go to the doctor and you expect a prescription to cure you for, that's seen as normal. Only in the last 100 years we've been able to do that at all. Before that, doctors could do nothing.
Yeah, they had nothing to give you. Yeah.
No, exactly. But still, life expectancy was rising even before we had any drugs at all. That's what surprised me.
And tell us a little bit about a bit more, about Alzheimer's, I suppose, because I don't know very much about Alzheimer's
Okay. Well, this is why it's so important. Yeah. So these are the very recent trends. So this is women in England for the last 20 years.
The last 20. Yeah.
So what you can see is, so the number one killer, heart disease, down here. Look how it's dropped. So this is the death rate. Sorry, that's a typo. That should be 100,000 people. So we have 100,000 random people across the country. And this is how many of those people are going to die in a year from a particular cause. And look how it's plummeted for heart disease and stroke. We're much better at dealing with cardiovascular problems. Of course, there's still major killers, but we're getting a real good grip on this. And part of this is simply less smoking.
Yeah.
And same with lower respiratory infections. So that's falling a lot. And I haven't shown men here. It's even more of these these conditions are even more important with men because they're more likely to be obese smokers who drink a lot. So improvements in lifestyles has really helped with having less heart attack and respiratory infections and things like that. The cancers are kind of stable. That's because life expectancy goes up. You've got to die from something. We're getting better. If we study improvements with the way we catch and deal with cancer, but you know, the number of people with cancer is increasing as heart attack goes down. That makes sense. So these are still important. We tried really hard with breast cancer, which was the #1 cause of death in women, and so breast cancer has significantly improved. Good thing. But look, so you've got to die from something else. We're doing all right with cardiovascular. Life expectancy keeps going up. So then what happens is dementia. But look how it's rocketing just in the last 20 years. And this isn't the number of cases, this is the death rate, right? So this is the probability of dying from dementia. So this is very strongly linked to old age, of course.
I was just going to say, is this just because people are living longer and therefore there is time for them to get Alzheimer's?
I think not. So that's the main reason. There are many more people are living to be 80 or 90. Okay, so they're living long enough for dementia to be a problem. I also think we're more aware of it and we're diagnosing more. You know, 50 years ago, we just write it off as, oh, you're just going senile and that's just a normal part of aging. And now we say, no, this should not be happening. These cognitive problems, you know, most people don't get it. Most people are mentally okay, whatever age they are, and that's normality. And so this is a disease. So it's recognizing it more. It's one of the things. But I think there's more to it now. I think there's a genuine increase in the likelihood of getting it, not just age and recognizing it. So as I said, 100 years ago, so Alzheimer reported this 100 years ago at a conference in Germany. And then 5 years later, all his colleagues came back and they said, well, have you seen any of Alzheimer's new disease? In all of Germany in 5 years, they reported 11 cases.
Wow.
And now it's hundreds of thousands, right? So I think there's genuinely many, many more people getting dementia, which points to, it can't be genetic, genetic wouldn't change that quickly. That suggests there's something environmental that's contributing to more cases of dementia. But this is really uncertain.
But okay, so I was just going to say, any ideas what? So you're basically saying something uncertain, but we don't yet know.
We have some ideas. So, you know, it could be, so related disease is Parkinson's, right? And we have a clear idea of environmental factors for that.
Right.
So you're more likely to get Parkinson's if you live in the countryside, if you drink water from a well rather than from the tap. And both these things point to pesticides. And we know some pesticides, particularly Rotenone, which is now banned, causes Parkinson's-like symptoms in animals. So it could have been exposure to pesticides has caused Parkinson's. So that's another possibility. If you work as a welder, you're more likely to get Parkinson's. So then you're inhaling metals, right? If you're a welder. So that points to environmental, being exposed to metals in some way, or it could be pollution from industry or cars. This is, you know, these are all hypotheses, and we don't know. Maybe it's all of them, and it's complicated. But we really need to get to the bottom of this, because if you understand the cause of a disease, then you can start to do something about it.
Yeah. So we're getting to the edges of what people understand about.
Yeah. This is current research. Yeah.
So here's a provocative question. So kind of course, we all of us, we die in the end. So does it matter how? Does knowing more about the causes and the nature of death, is it useful? I mean, why do you do it other than just?
Well, there are loads of great examples of once we understand a disease and its cause, then we can do something about it. For example, it was only definitively shown in the late 19th century that mosquitoes spread malaria, right?
Okay.
And we didn't know about there's this bacteria called Plasmodium falciparum, which is spread by mosquitoes. But you don't need to know that. If you know for sure that mosquitoes are spreading it, then even in the technology that had in Victorian times, they could do something about it. They could get rid of these pools of water around houses where mosquitoes were breeding and things like this, and drain swamps and not have unhealthy mosquito-ridden marshes in Essex, for example. And they would drain the marshes. So if you understand the cause of something, you do something about it. And about the same time, it was definitively proven that it was something in the water was causing cholera. And they didn't know what it was, but that really showed that if you provide clean water, you can wipe out a disease. So absolutely understanding the causes of death is really important.
Yeah.
And if we understand what's causing Alzheimer's, we may be able to do something about it.
Yeah. So, what do you think the future of death looks like?
Right. Well, if you look at this slide here, the easy answer will just say, well, these trends are going to continue. And there might be some truth in that. But what you really want me to do is predict the future. And what the really interesting question is, will there be some revolution? So we don't die from smallpox and cholera anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is brilliant. And the smallpox has killed 400 million people. And now it's zero, it's eradicated. So that's what we really want. We want to have major changes. And here, this is speculation. So we always, if you want to make the surest way to make a complete fool of yourself is to make predictions. Anyway, I'll have a go. So what I can see is current scientific research, and there are a few things going on that I really think we will be able to use in people in the next decade or two. One of those is using all this fantastic genetic information that we can so easily do now. So everybody will have their DNA sequenced, and then and this will happen. We will do this with unborn babies, so that if any baby is born with a genetic health condition, we'll know before they're born, and we can do something about it. But so then some babies are born and they suddenly have problems that are okay in the womb, and it's genetic, and they had no idea, and it's very difficult to diagnose. But now we'll sequence the DNA, and this will really help. And the other thing we'll be able to do looking at people's DNA is we'll be able to tell people what they're at risk from. So they'll say, you know, the good news is you're actually at a low risk of heart disease. Your cardiovascular DNA looks really good, but you are at higher risk from breast cancer. Therefore, we're going to do mammographies from a young age and things like this. So we use this kind of information. And we'll get DNA information. If you have cancer, that's caused by mutations in cells. We'll sequence the cells and pick up exactly what mutations you've got. We won't just say, oh, you've got pancreatic cancer or breast cancer. We'll say, well, the particular mutations you've got for your cancer are this, this, and this. Therefore, this is the drug for you. So we'll have personalized medicine based on this DNA information. So that's going to be a revolution.
Yeah. So are we looking at a future of no death from unnatural causes?
No. I'm just looking for improvements.
Yeah. So never able to get rid of all of it.
Oh, will we live forever? No.
No. Yeah, no, we're not going to live forever, because
well, what we can do, I think the realistic aim is to be like Japan, because Japan has the highest life expectancy in the world, right? Which is nearly 90. So if we just did what the Japanese did, that's what we would have, right? So they'd have an excellent healthcare system, equality, look after poor people, really good diet, no obesity, and so on and so on. These things, we know these things, right? These are not. So if we did that kind of thing, we could be like Japan. The other thing you can look at is people who do live to be 100 or even 110, and see what's special about them and what they do, and kind of learn from them. And we're looking at the DNA of these people as well, and understand what makes them special, and that's giving us real clues. So maybe we could be like the people. Maybe we could be like them.
I guess that becomes more practical when there are more of them. because it's hard to look at the DNA of people who are 110 when there's only half a dozen of them in the country. But when there were
the number of these super centenarians is growing fast. I think the last thing I looked at, I think there was a study where they had about 500 of these people, or maybe that was centenarians. These things are going. Yeah. And they're looking at the way these people live, what they eat, and they're picking up some things in their DNA as well, which gives pointers to what's important about having healthy. And these people actually don't get dementia. I don't know if you've ever spoken to somebody who's 100, but they're mentally generally absolutely with it. They're very frail and delicate. They're bored. Their friends died, 20 years ago. They don't have dementia.
Yeah, and that's a question that it does raise for me is, like you say, no, we won't all live forever, but would we want to, even if we could?
Well, what's important is all I've talked about is life expectancy, but of course that's that's a basic number, but that's just one number, and that's really crude. We absolutely need to think about quality of life as well. So we don't want people live with really debilitating disabilities or dementia or terrible pain or things like that. We want people to have high quality of life, and so that's another thing that you can look at and optimize. So there are conditions which are debilitating, like diabetes and arthritis and things, which are not going to kill you immediately, but really affect quality of life. So those things, it's absolutely valid to prioritize those as well.
Yeah. There's a question coming from Anna in the chat. Anna says, what about euthanasia? I'm a believer in that, dignity in dying.
What my personal opinion on what I think of euthanasia? I would support it with great care when the patient is of sound mind. They say they want this over a period of time, and healthcare professionals agree it's in their interest. I don't see any value. There are very obvious cases. If somebody has agonizing terminal bone cancer or leukemia and they've got weeks to live, I'm absolutely supportive of euthanasia in those cases. I think that's pretty clear. You mustn't just you have to have healthcare professionals involved who can be disinterested and consider the patient's best interests. I'm not a lawyer, and this is just my personal opinion. I know there's other people know more about it than I do, maybe you do. But something along those lines I would be supportive of. I think in some cases it would be the most compassionate thing to do. But I respect anybody else's opinion. My opinions have no more value on this than anybody else's.
Anna, does that answer your question?
I think partly I'm asking it because I did care for a lady who did want to die. She had MS and was drinking from a straw that she could hardly drink from.
Yep.
And there was no way of getting euthanasia for her.
Yeah.
And of course, it's not even legal in this country, although it's very popular. It's about 84% of people want it, and I think that the resources that are spent on terminal, very, very end of life care are enormous.
Yeah.
And we probably could redistribute some of that to the people who are maybe in need when they're younger and or struggling in other ways.
I agree. Yeah, I saw a video once which was kind of disturbing, but emotional, and it was I think the woman, I think she was about 30. She'd been in an accident. She was paralyzed from the neck down, and she could use her head, and she videoed herself committing suicide, and she had next to her, she had a drink with cyanide in the straw, and she turned to the camera and explained what she was doing and why, and saying this is entirely my decision, and turned and drank from the straw, and they videoed her dying, and they videoed it, and she'd had help, right, because she couldn't prepare that drink, and this video was made for legal reasons. and I think it was left at that, and I completely respected her decision to do that. She was clearly of sound mind, and she'd had help, and I respect the people that had helped her. If people want to do that, I've done some work with the Samaritans, and the Samaritans, you don't always try to. Their view is you don't always try to prevent suicide. Sometimes there'll be an active suicide, and you talk to them, they're firmly committed that this is what they want to do, and they want somebody to be with them on the phone, and you don't argue bitterly to talk them out, but you respect their decision. That's their policy, and I think that's right.
I know somebody who's in charge of rail safety, and his job is to deal with the fatalities on the line.
Yep.
And he tells me that they're expecting more this winter
because of poverty and
because of the way that the economy has been deliberately, in my view, trashed.
Yep. Yeah, I'm absolutely right.
Yeah, I mean, we're into really complex moral issues, aren't we?
I sort of wish that they wouldn't do it on the train lines, because obviously that then
so
a lot of difficulty for everybody else who's affected, which is thousands of people, thousands and thousands.
Correct. Yeah. So I wrote about suicide because it's an important cause of death, and particularly, working with young people all the time, it's the number one cause of death of people in their 20s, right? Who I work with, especially men. And car crashes is number 2. So I wrote about this, and the suicide section was very difficult to write, and I tried to do it with great care, and I got the Samaritans media officers to give me advice and approve it, and they maybe changed up the language, for example. And I looked up some horrific material that absolutely couldn't put in the book, like websites discussing just what you're talking about, different suicide methods, the so-called pros and cons. And just as you say, the rail one would be, one of the cons would be, you need to consider the effect on other people, and you'll absolutely traumatize the train driver and things like this.
And the people picking up. Also, I'm sorry if I'm hogging the conversation now, but there aren't many people to call. My job is to campaign for 20 mile an hour limits, because 30 miles an hour is just too fast. And because Bristol went 20 miles an hour, it saves 4 deaths a year and 170 injuries a year. And the figures across the country are, similar. How can we? I mean, Wales is going 20 miles an hour on the most roads on the 17th of September. Scotland has begun rolling it out with the Highlands, but England, they're not shifting. How do we persuade England, the transport minister and the Conservatives in England, to introduce what I think is the most effective public health method for preventing death and injury in our daily lives, which is lower road speeds?
Yeah, I think that's a question we leave hanging, because it's it's too specific for the.
Yeah, I know, but there are avoidable deaths.
Yeah, there are avoidable deaths. Yeah, Andrew, we're kind of coming to the end of our time. Is there anything else you're burning to say?
I can just say I covered car crashes. I'll just show you really briefly on this. So I wrote about cars. So car safety has actually really improved, and I wrote about a guy called Ralph Nader in the 1960s who campaigned for car safety and got massive improvements to car safety at this time, like forcing them to put on seat belts and testing cars, for impacts and things like this. They couldn't care less before then, and it's helped. So Model T Ford is extremely dangerous. So you had a plate glass windscreen, you had a cast iron steering column pointing at your chest. The brakes were hopeless. They rolled over, and he was wearing a hat. He's sitting on the fuel tank, so he could be burnt alive. And all these basic features here didn't exist. So Right? And there was just the idea of having a driving test was a really great idea. So previously you just went to the salesman showed you how to drive at the car and you bought it, off you went. And drunk driving, so there's a massive change in culture as well that came in the 1980s, where it's now not just legally unacceptable but socially unacceptable to drive drunk, and that's helped. And this is deaths per mile in the USA, and we can see how it's improved.
Wow,
this is
190 odd years, yeah.
Yeah, so you can see the mid-60s. This is Ralph Nader's campaign. We've got it down from here to here, right, with this new legislation. And then the drop here, this is cracking down on drunk driving. So these campaigns that you're talking about, Anna, they work, and we can see the effects of bringing in things like this, and compulsory seatbelts. We really see these things work and stop people driving like idiots, and enforcing speed limits and stuff. When we did things like this, we'd see it in the data. It worked. And that 20 times safer per mile. Number of deaths on the road is basically flat in the last 100 years. That's because people drive much more, but the cars themselves are much more dangerous. Much safer. Cars are all the same shape now. Have you ever noticed that? They all, and they're optimized not just for aerodynamics, but the corners of them are all curved, and they're all shaped to, if they hit a passenger, to deflect the passenger onto the side, rather than being trapped under the wheels, which is what they used to do. So, and this stuff doesn't come from the manufacturers. It's pressure groups pressuring politicians who pass laws to make these things happen. So, yeah, it can be done, Anna, and there's lots of examples of this kind of thing happening and having real benefits on the roads.
Yeah.
I cycle, and I've been knocked off my bike twice. I've been hit 7 times in the car, and they've all been people crashing into the back of me. And the worst I've had is a bit of whiplash. I've been knocked off my bike twice, and that really is scary. And I'd like something to be done to protect cyclists. But anyway, that's my particular bugbear.
Well, and that's a really nice note to end on, really, because I think what that highlights for me is that because a lot of the slides we've been, you can look at them and see and think that death is inevitable, that it's kind of, it has its own momentum, if you like. And what this note that you're ending on is actually saying, no, it's not just the scientists who can invent things that will bring down diseases, but actually campaign groups and people who social groups who decide that certain ways of dying are not okay have an impact.
Totally. Can I give you one more example of that? So there are many diseases which were totally cured 50 years ago. We invented vaccines which are 100% reliable against lots of lethal diseases, like polio is well known, measles, and these diseases don't just go on. And the problem is not that we're not hanging around waiting for scientists to come up with a cure for measles. We got it, we invented it in the 60s. The problem is getting people to take the vaccine, and that's a social and political issue. It's not scientific.
Very interesting. Yeah, very interesting end. Thank you very much, Andrew. Really appreciate that. Your book details and how, if people want to buy it, they're on the original flyer. And when I save this and upload it, I'll stick it on YouTube, and I'll put the link in that as well. I think I'm right in saying it's out in paperback in January. Well, after.
Yes, yeah. The hardback came out in February. An audio version is already out. Paperback's coming out in January, and it's coming out in 9 other languages. So if you'd rather read it in Korean or Turkish, you'll be able to do so.
Yeah, great that it's got that much international attention. Yeah. So I think on that note, we'll say thank you very much. Thanks to the people who made it into the call, and hopefully other people can catch up and watch afterwards.
Yeah, all right.